Hello world, this is CS50, and this is web programming with Python and JavaScript, with CS50's own Brian Yu. This course picks up where CS50 itself leaves off, diving more deeply into the design and implementation of web apps with Python, JavaScript, and SQL using frameworks like Django, React, and Bootstrap.
We'll start by taking a closer look at HTML and CSS, languages that we can use to describe the structure and the style of web pages. After that, we'll introduce Git, a version control tool that we can use to keep track of changes we make to our code, and also to allow multiple people to collaborate on the same project at the same time. After that, we'll dive more deeply into Python, exploring some more advanced features of the programming language, and in particular, how we can use it in order to create dynamic web applications using a web framework known as Django. We'll leverage Django, and in particular, its ability to deal with data, working with SQL, models, and migrations to create web applications that use a database in order to create interactive user experiences. After that, we'll dive more deeply into another programming language, JavaScript, exploring how we can use JavaScript to create dynamic and interactive user interfaces, writing code that responds to events and also manipulates a web page in response to some kind of user interaction. After that, we'll explore some best practices in industry, including testing to make sure that our code works as expected, and also continuous integration and continuous delivery to allow us to rapidly make changes and deploy those changes to our code whenever we're able to make those updates. And then finally, we'll consider concerns around scalability and security. As we take our applications and move them from our own computers to the web, where anyone can access them, we'll talk about how we make sure that these applications are able to scale and how we're able to make sure that these applications are secure. Along the way, you'll have an opportunity to put all of this into practice by building web applications of your very own. This is CS50. To say, here is a way for the user to submit the form. Type equals submit means this is how they're going to submit. submit the form when they're done completing it. Now if I open up form.html, this is the page that we're ultimately going to see when we load this HTML. This entire page just contains a single HTML form, but that HTML form contains two parts. The first part was this input element here that allowed an opportunity for the user to type in their full name. They type in their full name into this input field, and when they're done, they can click the submit button to indicate that they would like to now submit this form. Of course, right now, this form isn't going to do anything when we type in our name and click submit, because we haven't added any logic in order to handle this form. But later on, as we transition into the world of building web applications using Python, we'll see how we can design a form such that after the user submits it, we save information to a database or display some sort of results back to the user, all by using the power of building these web applications and connecting them to these sorts of HTML forms. And HTML forms can actually get quite a bit more complex. We'll take a look at another example, for instance. Let me open up form1.html.
Contestando más todas las respuestas de un ciudadano. Abajo, ¿no?
HTML, which is a form that I built in advance, which shows a number of other ways that users can provide information as input to an HTML form. Here we see an input whose type is text, meaning we want the user to type in their name as text. But you might also imagine that if a user is logging into a website, for example, they might, in addition to typing in a text-based name or username or email, also provide a password. And generally, if you've been on a website and you've typed in a password, the password characters don't all show up as the actual characters. For security reasons, they generally show up as just little dots on the screen, hiding the actual characters that they're representing. And in HTML, we can do that very easily by just saying that the type of this input is password. If they're typing in a password, our web browser will know not to actually display those individual characters. In addition to just text-based input, we also have radio button input, as I alluded to a moment ago. So here we have a number of different radio inputs where the user might be able to select from a number of options, choosing their favorite color, for example, from a number of these options. And finally, just to take it one look at one other additional feature of HTML5, in fact a new feature of HTML5, is something we might call a data list. where we might have the user choose in a dropdown from a number of different options, but we want to very quickly filter down or autocomplete based on those options. So if the user needs to select what country they're from, for example, we might have an input field and specify that it's going to be associated with a list called countries. Then, immediately below that, I have a data list element whose ID is countries, where here I'm going to specify these are all of the options for what country we could have. Each one is inside of an option element whose value is whatever country they could select, and we have all of the countries of the world listed in these option elements. So this input here, value is whatever country they could select. And we have all of the countries of the world listed in these option elements. So this input here is going to allow me to select one option from a list of all of these possible options. So now if I open up form1.html, here's what that form ultimately looks like. I can here inside of the name field, again that word name shows up because it's the placeholder. I can type in my name here, and inside of the password field, anything I type is going to show up as just little dots instead of the actual characters, because the type of that input field was password instead of the type being text. In favorite color, I now have the ability to choose between various different favorite color options in a radio button format. I choose from one of a number of options. And finally, inside this country dropdown, I have the ability now, when I click on it, to see all of the countries. But as I start to type letters, like U, N, I, T, it filters down to only the options that I actually care about. So here, if I type in enough letters, eventually I see United States, and I can click on that option as well. So HTML5 builds in these additional features to make it easy to implement something, like a text field where it will autocomplete based on the text that you provide. You can just specify that it is inside of this data list, and then provide a list of all the possible values, and then HTML and your web browser in turn will take care of the process of rendering that information in the way that you expect it to be displayed. So those are just some of the possible HTML elements that we can ultimately create by using these various different elements that we nest within each other. And there are definitely other HTML elements that exist as well that you can begin to explore, but all of them follow a very similar pattern. That we're going to have some tag that might require some attributes, additional information about the HTML, to give context to the web browser for how that element should be displayed. Maybe that element needs to have a particular source for an image, maybe it needs a link in order to link to somewhere, or other information as well. And then inside of that element, you might nest other elements, so that your table has rows, and inside of those rows we have other cells, and you might imagine nesting elements inside of other elements, inside of other elements. But right now, so far, all of our web pages have been rather simple. They've just been, we've described the structure of the page, and we've described we want a list here, we want a form there. What we might really like is some way of specifying that we want to style our web page in some way. We want to add color, we want to add spacing, we want to add some sort of other layout to our page as well. And in order to do that, we're going to use a second language that we're going to call CSS, short for Cascading Style Sheets. In particular, we'll use the latest version of CSS, Css3, which gives us the ability to take an HTML page and tell the web browser how we would like it to be styled. Instead of just black text in the same font on a white background, we can begin to specify particular CSS properties of how we would like this page to look to make sure that the page looks the way we want it to. So let's take a look at a simple example now of CSS to take a look at how we can add some CSS code to our page. So I'll go ahead and create a new file that I'll call style.html. Just to demonstrate some basic ideas of adding some style to our page. And we'll go ahead and copy the same hello.html from before. And maybe in addition to hello world, I display an H1, some big heading at the top that says like welcome to my web page, for example. So now if I open up style.html, this is what I see. I see a big heading at the top that says welcome to my web page, beneath which is just the text hello world. And now imagine that I want to add some style to this heading at the top of the page. Maybe instead of being left aligned, I want it to be centered. Maybe instead of just being black text, I'd like to change the color. In order to do that, just as we've used attributes in the past to add additional information to this particular HTML page, we can do a very similar thing with CSS. We can specify that we're going to give this H1 element a style attribute, and that is going to be equal to, and then in quotation marks, we're going to provide all of the CSS properties that we would like to add to this particular element. So the way that CSS styling works is that we can give elements individual CSS properties, where a property is something like the color of the element or the alignment of the element. And each of those properties has a default value, but we can change its value to something else. So if, for example, I wanted to change the color of this heading so that instead of a black heading, it displayed as a blue heading, I could say for this H1, I would like to give it a color property, and then to give the color property a value, I say color colon, and then the value that I would like to give to it. So color colon blue, for example, followed by a semicolon, will change the color of this H1 element to blue. And my text editor is automatically showing me a little square that shows me what this color blue is actually going to look like. This isn't part of the text, it's just my text editor being helpful so that I can see in advance as I'm writing this code what the color is actually going to look like. So now if I open up style.html, here's what I see. Instead of a black heading at the top, we've changed the color to blue. And there are many other built-in colors that exist within HTML that we can use in order to change the color to whatever we want. If instead of blue I said I want the color to be red, for instance, I can refresh the page, and now the heading is red. And there are many other colors. I can change the color to like spring green, for instance, and that's going to be a particular shade of green that
No, that's the name.
And that's going to be a particular shade of green that displays just like this. And so now we have the ability to add various different style properties to individual elements. I can say, take this heading and change its style so that the color, instead of being black, is going to show up as blue instead. And if I want to add multiple CSS properties to the same HTML element, I can do that as well. Here in the style attribute, I can say that in addition to saying that the color is blue, I'd like to give a second CSS property to this element. I'd like to say that the text align property should be center, for example. The text align property controls, as you might imagine, how a particular HTML element has its text aligned. Is it all the way on the left, all the way on the right, or centered? And if I change the text align property to have a value of center, well then now when I refresh this page, I see that welcome to my web page is now both blue and it's centered. I've changed the color and I've changed the alignment of this particular element. And HTML elements don't need to just be styled directly. They can also get their style information from parent elements. So if you recall again that DOM structure, where we have an HTML element inside of which is this body element, and inside of the body element is this h1 element and this text, you can imagine if we wanted this styling to apply not just to this heading, but also to the hello world text, I could move the styling information, move this style attribute, change it from the h1, and escalating it to this body. And if I move the style to the body, then everything inside of the body is going to be styled in that way. So let's now take a look at an example of that to see how that works. If I take this style information and I move it so that instead of associating it with the h1, I instead associate it with the body, then now, when I refresh the page, I see that both parts of the body, both the big heading at the top that says welcome to my web page, as well as the text hello world, both have those CSS properties applied. I've changed their color to blue, and I've also changed their text alignment to be centered instead of just left aligned. But if I do want it to just be that heading, then I can move it out and say that I just want to apply the style to that one individual heading. Now, one thing that we might imagine might become a problem over time is that imagine if I had multiple headings that I wanted to style in the same way, for example. Let's say I have a second heading that this is a second heading that I also want to be styled as blue and centered as well. I can refresh this page and see that right now that is not the case. And I don't want to make the entire entire page blue and centered. I only want these two headings to be blue and centered. So what I could do is I could just take the style code from the H1 and apply it to this H1 as well, so that both of my H1 elements now have the exact same style code. And I'll go ahead and refresh this, and now we see this is the intended behavior. I have two headings, both of which are centered and both of which are blue. But what we want to start to think about as we start to build web applications, and especially as our web applications start to get a little bit more sophisticated, is to think about the design of how we're building our web pages and how we're building our web applications. And in particular, anytime we find ourselves copying a lot of the same information from one place to another, that's probably not the best design. And you should start to think about how might you design this a little bit better. It's not great design, one, just because there's some redundancy that probably doesn't need to be there, but also because it makes the page a little bit more difficult to change and a little more difficult to update. If I instead want to change both of these headings to be red instead of blue, then all of a sudden I need to change my code in two places. I need to change the style attribute on this first heading up here, and I also need to change the style attribute on this second heading down there. What I'd like to do is to somehow just be able to write the style code once and then have it applied to both of these headings. And in fact, there is a way to do that. What we can do is, instead of doing what we might call inline styling, where we take the CSS code and place it directly as an attribute of an HTML element, we can move our style code to an entirely different part of the web page. Recall again that at the top of our HTML page, we have this head section that just includes information that's useful to know about the web page, but isn't actually part of the body of the web page, the content that the user sees. This head section is a great place where we can begin to put some style information about how we would like for this web page to be styled. So what I can do here is, instead of putting these style attributes inside, in line with these HTML elements, I can, inside of the head section of my web page, add a style element, where in between these, the opening style tag and the closing style tag, I can add any of the style information that I want. And here's the way that syntax is going to look. I first need to specify what types of elements am I going to style. And in this case, I want to style all of the H1s. So I can just say H1, and then all of the style code is going to go inside of a pair of curly braces, where I can say I would like the color to be blue, and I would like the text align property to be centered. So now, here's what I've done. I've taken the CSS code that used to be down here inside the body of the page, actually as an attribute of these H1 elements, and I've moved the style-related code to a different part of my page altogether. Now the style information is inside the header of my page, inside of the style element, where I've said, for every H1 element, here's how you should style it. The styling is in between the opening and curly closing braces here, and I've said that every H1 should have a color of blue, and every H1 should have a text align property of center. And that is then going to apply to all of the H1 elements that my web page happens to find inside the body of my web page. So there's a couple of advantages here. Advantage number one is what we talked about a moment ago. I don't need to duplicate the same code in both of these H1 elements. I can write it once and say apply this styling to all of the H1s that show up in the page. And advantage number two is we've been able to factor out the style code to somewhere else just to make it a little bit cleaner. So that instead of having a really long line, you might imagine if we had not just 2, but maybe 5 or 6 or 7 different CSS properties that would have taken up a lot of space on one line, I can instead, in a more readable, more organized way, move that style-related code to the style element at the beginning of the page, just to make it easier to read, easier to visually understand, and just to clean up the body of the web page as well. And that's going to be another of the key themes that's going to come up again and again in this class, this idea of separating things out so that every piece can sort of be independent of one another. Our structure of the web page inside the body is separate from the style. And we'll see the same sort of idea appear again and again as we begin to try to design web applications well. So now if I take this exact same page and go ahead and refresh style.html, we'll see that we see the exact same thing. Both of the headings still show up as centered, both of them still show up as blue, but now we have the advantage of having only written the style code once instead of needing to write the exact same style code multiple times in the same way. But it turns out that we can even do a little bit better than this. Because one thing you might imagine is that if I have a web application or a website that has multiple different web pages, it's probably going to be likely that each of those web pages might need to be styled in similar ways. If I have a big banner at the top of one web page, then in other pages related to that page, I might want the same banner styled in the same way using similar style information. And right now, our CSS code is specific to one particular page. And it's not going to be easy to then take that same styling and apply it to another page. If I wanted to, I'd need to copy the exact same CSS code, put it inside of another page, but then we run into the same problem of duplication, where I've now had to repeat myself across multiple different pages, putting the exact same CSS code across all those different pages. So there is an improvement we can make, and the improvement we can make is to take that CSS code and just move it to an entirely different file. So instead of putting this style code inside of a style element inside of this HTML page, I'll just create a new file that I'll call styles.css, inside of which is going to be all of the CSS that I care about. I want to take every H1, I want to change its color to blue, and now I want to change its text align property to center. And now, inside of my HTML page, I know I want to take every H1, I want to change its color to blue, and now I want to change its text align property to center.
Y me quedan todas correlativas, o sea que si no pruebo la luna porque me escribe una tasa un
And now, inside of my HTML page, I no longer need to include any CSS at all. Instead of this style element altogether, I can just link my CSS code in that CSS file called styles.css to this particular HTML page. And how do I link the styles.css file? Well, I can do so, again, in the head section of my web page using a link tag, where I can say I'd like this link to be, the relationship is it's going to be a style sheet, meaning what I'm about to link is going to be a style sheet for this page. It's going to describe how I want for the elements on this page to be styled. And then, just as in the case of a link to another page, I used href to specify a hyperlink reference, what I want to link to. I'm now going to specify, using an href attribute, what CSS file I would like to now link. And in this case, the CSS file that I'm going to link is styles.css. That is the file that just so happens to contain all of the CSS that I would like to apply to this particular file. Now if I refresh the page, I see again, nothing has changed. In the last two revisions, the page has stayed exactly the same as far as the user is concerned. They still see two headings, both of them are centered, both of them are blue, but now the advantage is that here is my HTML. It's shorter than it was before, and in particular, there's no CSS that's baked in to this HTML file at all. I factored it all out into this separate styles.css file. And now if I have multiple HTML files that are all using the same styling, I can just link them all to the same styles.css file such that they're all using the same style information. I don't need to repeat myself. And if ever I need to make a change across all of those pages, I just change the styling once. I change the styles.css file, and then all of the web pages that are linked to that style sheet will update as well in order to reflect those changes. So again, we've been able to factor out some of this style information to a separate file just to make our lives a little bit easier. All right, so far we've now seen how we can use CSS in a number of different ways to add some basic styles to our page. We've seen that we can take an element and change its color. We've seen how we can take an element and change its alignment, move it from left aligned to right aligned to centered, for example. As it turns out, there are a lot of different CSS properties that we can add to our HTML elements in order to style them in various different ways, more than we'll have time to talk about in this lecture. But now let's just take a look at a couple of the most popular, most common CSS properties that we can add in order to make our web pages look the way we want it to. And one of the most powerful tools for CSS is controlling the size of various different elements. By default, HTML just used a default size for everything on the page. But if I want to more precisely control how big any particular element is, I can use CSS in order to do so. So let me now create a new file that I will call size.html. We'll start with the same HTML code and call the page size. And now inside the body of my page, let me just have a vertical section of my page, just some section of my page that's going to have some content. And I'm going to put this inside of a div tag. Now this is the first time that we've seen a div in HTML. You can think of a div as just a division of the page, some section of the page that's going to have some content inside of it. And we use divs because it makes it easy to reference a particular div or nest information inside of other pieces of information, or just to divide and break up our page into multiple different sections. Here inside of the body, I'm just going to have a single div that is going to say something like hello world. And now I'm going to add some style to this page in order to control the size of this div, to control the size of this section of my web page. I could use inline styling, I could factor things out into another file, but since I'm only dealing with one file for now, I'm just going to add a style section to the top of my web page, just so you can more clearly see how the style of this page is going to map on to the way that we're modifying these HTML elements. And I would like to style this div in a couple of ways. One thing I can do is give the div a background color. Let me change its background color to blue, for example. And then I can say, all right, I'd like to give this div a width and a height, some size information. I can say, go ahead and give this div a width of 100 pixels, and maybe a height of 400 pixels. So now when I go ahead and open up size.html, I can say, go ahead and give this div a width of 100 pixels, and maybe a height of 400 pixels.
Lógicamente, ya no es una cosa chica. Por la solución. Después no existe.
So now when I go ahead and open up size.html, this is what I see. I see in a 100 by 400 pixel wide vertical or rectangular section of my page, I see the words hello world. And so you might imagine as you have multiple different elements on your page, as your web pages start to get a little bit more complex, you probably want to have some more precise control over how wide or how tall any particular element is. And these width and height attributes can be very helpful because I can very easily change the width to say like 500 pixels, for example. And now when I refresh the page, now I see that the width of this page, this div, this section of the page, has actually now gotten a lot wider. And so we have the ability to control size using CSS. Go ahead and close some of these pages that I no longer need. And now take a look at some other things that we can do. In addition to controlling the size, and let me change this color to something a little bit lighter, something like orange, such that now when I open the size, it looks like this.
Coordinación general de gestión y calidad.
I'll make this a little bit smaller. Let's try 200 by 200
El año
pixels.
pasado y este año no reformaron
It looks now
el
like
Centro de Justicia, Coordinación General de Gestión y Calidad y así. Coordinación General de Gestión y Calidad y
like this. You might imagine there are some other changes that I might like to make. Like this hello world, for example, is very close to the edge of this particular div. It's right up against the upper left corner of that div. I might want to change that by adding what we might call some padding to this particular HTML element, some space, just so that the content of the element isn't so close to the border of the element itself. So for example, one thing I can do is inside this div, add some padding. Say maybe I want 20 pixels worth of padding on the inside of the element, such that now when I refresh the page, we see that we have some padding along the outside of the element, so that hello world now shows up not right up against the edge of the element, but inside a little bit as well. And if we have a particular HTML element that maybe is too close to the edge of the screen, maybe it's too close to the top of the screen, we can also add space around outside of the element by adding what we call margin to the element as well. So I can say, let's give it 20 pixels of margin inside of this div. And then refresh, and now we see that whereas before this div was very close to the upper left edge of the screen, now we've moved it 20 pixels away from everything, so it's got some space on all four sides of it. So that's how we can now use margin and padding just to make the page look a little bit nicer to the user, so objects are not too close together or too far apart. Padding, again, is on the inside of the border of the element. I can add 20 pixels of padding, for example, to make sure that the content inside of the element, in this case the words hello world, just have a little bit of space from the border. And that's padding on the inside of the element. Margin, meanwhile, is on the outside of the element. We add some margin along the outside of the border to space the element out from other elements that might be nearby it, to make sure that there's enough space between the border of the element from the top of the screen and also from the left and also the bottom and the right, though there's no objects there that we're currently creating space from. So by combining width and height and margin and padding, we now have the ability, using CSS, to make sure that we're able to lay out our page the way we want to lay out the page, so that elements have the right amount of spacing from each other and are the correct size. So now let's take a look at some other features that CSS is going to give us. In addition to just changing where particular elements are, like centering text or adding size and margin and padding, we can also use CSS to change how elements actually look. We've seen it to change the color of text, changing it from one color like black to another color like blue. But we can also use CSS to be able to change something like the font that we use in order to display text. Modern web pages don't show everything in the exact same font. Usually some designer is choosing what font they want for any particular web page. So let's experiment with those possibilities. I'll now create a new file that I'll call font.html.
Es una locura. Y innovación, el año pasado dio un palo y era 157.
Se acepta todo lo que se pide. O no.
Side of which will be an HTML page called font. And inside the body, I'll again just have a div that says hello world. Same as before. But now, inside of the style tag here, up in the head section of my web page, I would like to add some font information to this div.
Grabaciones previstas para el periodo 2022 de
And in particular, there are a number of different font-related CSS properties that I can add to control the font of any particular HTML element. One thing I can specify is the font family, specifying what font would I like to use in order to display this text. And maybe I want to display it in Arial, for example, which is a common font used on the internet, such that now, if I open up
El segundo formulario A proyecto de la Dirección General de Administración con el sitio de grabación previsto para distribuir para poner el monto de todo el
for example, which is a common font used on the internet, such that now, if I open up font.html, I now see in Arial the words hello world, different from the text that I was using before. You can also specify multiple different fonts. Not all computers support all fonts, so I could specify that just in case Arial isn't supported, fall back to any sans serif font, any of the fonts that don't have the little glyphs at the edge of each of the characters. So now if I refresh the page, because my web browser supports Arial, I don't notice anything different, but you might imagine if you're using more complex fonts that not all web browsers have or support, you might add some backups just in case the font you want isn't actually available. In addition to a font family, I might also specify a font size, how big I want the font to be inside of this div. So I can specify that I'd like the font size of this div to be, 28 pixels, for example, such that now I refresh it, and now this div appears using larger text, 28 pixels, for example. Such that now I refresh it, and now this div appears using larger text. And I can also, just as like text editors let you specify whether you want it to be normal text or bold text, I can specify a font weight for this div and say that in addition to being in font Arial and size 28, I would also like for the font to be bold, such that now I refresh it, and now the font shows up as bold. And using these CSS style sheets, we're able to selectively apply the styling to only particular parts of the web page. If I have another underneath this div, some more text down here, for example, that additional text that's outside of the div isn't going to be affected by the CSS styling, such that now if I refresh this page, some more text shows up in that same standard default font provided by my web browser, and not the custom font that I have specified to apply to only this particular part of the HTML page.
Yo no voy a comparar con
So that now is the ability to add fonts to our page too. Another thing that we might want to do is to be able to add some sort of border around our HTML elements. So maybe I want a line to be able to separate this entire part of the page from another part of the page. So I could add a border by going to this div and saying, let me give this div a border, and maybe I want the border to be like a 3-pixel solid black border, for instance. I can specify how big I want the border to be. I can specify whether I want the border to be a solid line or a dashed or dotted line, and I can specify what color I would like that border to be as well. So now when I refresh this, I now see I have a border around this entire section, around this entire div inside of my web page. And you can imagine these borders being helpful for styling various different parts of my page. So for example, if we go back to that table that we were looking at a moment ago when we were dealing with oceans, where I had ocean and Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean, this is structured in the format of a table. We have rows and columns, but it doesn't look great right now. I might like to add some styling in order to improve the way that this table looks. For example. So let's give that a try. I'll go ahead and go back into table.html, that HTML file I was using before where I had this table, and let me now add some style information to this table. I might say that for this table, I would like to give it a border that is maybe a 1-pixel solid black border.
lo que mandó el Centro de Justicia de la Mujer en
such that now when I refresh the page, I have a 1 pixel solid black border around the entirety of the table.
en el expediente y le saqué un screenshot para que no.
All right, that's great, but I also really wanted a border in between the rows and the columns as well. In particular, every table data item, I might like to have some additional CSS applied to those too. So I might say for every table data cell, again, TD stood for table data, and those were the individual cells within my table. I might specify that I would like those to also have a border that is 1 pixel solid black, such that now I refresh the page, and now each of my table data cells also has a border around it.
Al examen para dar presente.
Also have a border that is 1 pixel solid black.
Se puede compartir la foto, ¿no? ¿Cómo? La foto no se puede compartir. No. De JPG a PDF. Y después pasa de PDF a Excel. De JPG.
Such that now I refresh the page, and now each of my table data cells also has a border around it. Now this applied to the table data cells in the body of my page, but it didn't yet apply to these cells up in the heading, and that's because those were TH elements, table headers. And so here we have a couple of options. I could specify once more, table headers, I would like to give a border of 1 pixel solid black.
No se comporta.
But when I do so, you'll see that it does create a border around those table headers. But again, one thing that should be crossing your mind now is that there's a fair amount of redundancy here, some repeated style code that shows up in multiple different places. Table data cells in the body of my page, I really want to be styled in a very similar way to table header cells. And so it would be nice if I could somehow consolidate these two different CSS selectors, these ways of me saying style table data, style table headers. I'd like to combine them into one. And you can in fact do this in CSS. There are a number of different CSS selectors, ways of choosing elements. And one of them is just called the multiple element selector. That if I want to select both table data cells and table headers, then I can do so by saying td, comma, th, and delete these 3 lines down there. What these 3 lines are now saying are that I would like to style all table data cells and table headers in the same way. And I could even combine table if I wanted to for good measure. But I'd like to give all of them a border of 1 pixel solid black.
No, yo por lo que me fijé no estaba... ¿Cómo lo buscaste vos recién? No, busqué por el expediente. Claro. Y te buscaba en el archivito de respuesta. Adiós. Hasta mañana.
Such that now I refresh it, and now I see that they all have this border around them. Now, most tables you see on the internet don't have both a table or a border around everything in the table and also a border around each of the individual cells. Usually those are collapsed just into a single line, and it turns out that CSS has an easy way for you to do this as well. I can add a CSS property to the table called border collapse and just say I would like to collapse all of the borders in the table. Just going to show you there are many, many different CSS properties, far more than we'll be looking at today, but they're easy things to reference. So you can easily look up how to collapse borders in a table and then find a CSS property like this that you can then use and apply to your web page. So now I refresh that, and now I see that I have a border, just a single border, around all of the cells in this particular page. Next, what I might like to do, though, is like add some space around here. Like it seems like this text is very tight against the border of this table. So in order to do so, I want to add some spacing. And recall again, do I want margin or padding? Margin is spacing around outside of the border of a particular HTML element, whereas padding is inside of the border. So if I want some space inside of the border just to space out the text from the border itself, then what I want is padding inside of all of my table cells. So I can say, let me add 5 pixels inside of all of my table data cells and table header cells. Refresh the page, and now here's what the resulting table looks like. So if I want some space inside of the border just to space out the text from the border itself, then what I want is padding inside of all of my table cells. So I can say, let me add 5 pixels worth of padding. Inside of all of my table data cells and table header cells. Refresh the page, and now here's what the resulting table looks like. Just by adding a little bit of CSS, specifying what border I want around the edge of the page, specifying a little bit of padding inside of each of the cells, my table now looks a whole lot nicer than it did just a few lines of code ago when I just had the HTML structure of the page and not the CSS to describe how I actually want that page to be styled. And notice again that in doing so, we were able to use one of these CSS selectors. I was able to say that I wanted to use the multiple element selector, which is just this comma here, to specify that I would like to apply this styling not just to TDs, but also to THs as well. We'll take a look at some additional examples of CSS selectors in just a moment. But next, let's turn our attention to some more tricky instances where we might want to apply styling to multiple elements at the same time. Let's imagine, and let's go back to style.html, where we had some style code, where I had one heading. I'll call this heading 1. And let's give myself two other headings, heading 2 and heading 3. All of these now are h1 elements that are going to show up the same way, such that now if I style and say I would like all h1s to show up with a color of blue, then when I open this page where I have 3 h1 tags, each of which has a color of blue, when I open show up with a color of blue, then when I open this page where I have 3 h1 tags, each of which has a color of blue, when I open up style.html, what I'm going to see is something like this. 3 headings, each of which happens to have a color of blue. But what would happen now if I wanted to style only the first heading? I want heading 1 to be blue, but I don't want to style heading 2 and heading 3. How do I do that? Well, one thing we could do is go back to the inline styling we did a moment ago, where inside of h1 I said style color is blue, and that would say for just this very first heading, I would like that to be blue, but not the other elements at all. But this, again, we decided was not the best design. This inline styling, commingling of HTML and CSS just gets a little bit messy, and it would be nice to be able to factor all of our style code to a separate part of the page altogether. So how do we do this? Well, we need some way to uniquely reference this particular HTML element. And in order to do so, we can give an HTML element an ID. An ID is just some unique name we give to an HTML element so that we can reference it more easily later on. Let me just go ahead and give this an ID of foo. It could be any ID you want, but foo is just a generic name here. And now we've given this heading a name such that in other parts of our page or in other code, we can reference and find this particular HTML element. And in particular now, in the style section of my web page, instead of styling all h1 elements, I only want to style the element that has an ID of foo. IDs are by definition unique. There can only be one element in this page that has an ID of foo, otherwise it's not valid HTML. And so in order to do so, we're going to use hashtag foo. The hash mark symbol is just CSS's way of selecting just something with a particular ID. So instead of just h1, for selecting all of the h1 tags, if I want to select something by its ID, I say hash foo to say only style the element that has an ID of foo and give it a color of blue. For example. So this style code now will find something with a particular ID and give it a style to correspond with it, such that now, if I reload this page, only heading 1 is styled. Heading 2 and heading 3 are not. I've been able to name heading 1, give it a name of foo, an ID of foo, and then in my style code, just style that particular part of my HTML page. Of course, what if I wanted to style multiple but not all of the headings? Like maybe I want to style both heading 1 and heading 2. Now I could use a second ID, maybe give this an ID of bar, for example, and then style both the element with ID foo and the element with ID bar. But now we're starting to add IDs unnecessarily. I have too many different names. Things could start to get messy, especially as my web pages start to get bigger. So while IDs are a way of giving a name to an HTML element that is unique, sometimes I want to give a name to an HTML element that is not unique, some name that can apply to multiple different HTML elements. And when we do that, we call that a class. An ID is a way of giving a unique name to an HTML element, while a class is a way of giving a name to an HTML element that might not be unique. It might apply to 0 or 1 or 2 or more different HTML elements. So here's what that might look like. Instead of giving each of these h1s an ID that's different, I can give each one a class. We'll give this a class of Baz, again just another arbitrary name that we've chosen, and I'll give this h1 a class of Baz as well. They both belong to this same class called Baz in this case. And now inside of my style code, I would like to say, just style the elements that are of class Baz. And just as we had a special symbol, the hashtag, for styling only something with a particular ID, to style everything with a particular class, I can use a dot. So dot Baz, in this case, is going to style only the elements that have a class of Baz. So here I can now say, take all of the elements with a class of Baz and go ahead and give those a color of blue. So now I have two h1s that belong to class baz, the other h1 does not, and I've styled only the things that are of class baz, such that now when I go back to the page and refresh the page, my first two headings, those do get styled as blue, but the third heading does not, because I've applied a class to these two elements that does not get applied to this third element there. So oftentimes it can be very helpful if you have to start to design larger web pages where you have multiple different elements, some of which might be styled in some ways, and other elements that might be styled similarly to one another. You can add IDs and classes to your HTML elements just to clean up the way that you write your CSS, to be able to very specifically pinpoint one element that you want to apply style to, or to apply styling to entire class of elements as well. Now, one tricky thing you might imagine now is that now we have multiple ways of referencing the exact same element. So for example, if you imagine that I just had a single h1, which had an ID of foo, for example, that I've named foo, what would happen if, for instance, I said all of the h1s, I would like those to be colored red, and all of the elements with an ID of foo, or the only element with an ID of foo, I would like that to be colored blue. What might happen then? These would seem to be conflicting, where now suddenly we have an h1 style tag that is saying I should style h1s in this way, but I should style element foo in another way. So what happens if I have an h1 whose ID is foo? How do I choose to style that? And in order to deal with that, we have to start to deal with the CSS problem of specificity, of what happens when I have multiple different CSS selectors that could apply to the exact same HTML element.